been correcting some of the history quizzes, the previous one, the one previous to this, and I realized sometimes it's necessary to do in correcting such things some additional fact-checking that whichever the book from which I got the number of priests, nuns, and monks who were killed during the Spanish Civil War during the Red Terror was much higher than the number that I got from, the number was 700, was the one I got from that book. And looking back on it, the passage was a little unclear as to what the author was actually saying, and it could be that he was referring to one single massacre, because the actual number was much higher than 700. It was more like 7,000, or that's at least one estimate. Estimates as to the number of people killed during the course of the Spanish Civil War vary widely. Some estimate 38,000. This is talking about people killed in any kind of executionary way. Estimates range from a little under 40,000 to over 100,000. So estimates vary widely, so it seems that it's difficult to pin down exact numbers, but the author of the particular book from which I got that number, I realize now, either chose an extraordinarily low estimate for the number of religious killed during the war, or perhaps was referring in a way that was unclear just to one massacre, which is believable. But anyway, just doing just a little further research, it became clear that there were actually many thousands were killed. So as far as the answer on the quiz, I would accept number 700 because that's what I had in the notes taken from that particular author. The book from which I was taken was very well researched and very well written, but for some reason on that point it was either clearly off, or definitely not in accordance with what is the numbers that are usually given, or perhaps also be uncharacteristically unclear in that section. So just a point on that. That was far bloodier than, 700 would be bad enough in itself, but it was far worse than that. Okay, so continuing on with this, also, yes, many of these books from which much of this information comes is presented by authors who are good researchers and good writers, but who are very liberal in one way or another. Not exactly traditional Catholics. So there's a great deal of let's say, sifting that has to go on, a great deal of processing that has to go on, because they present the facts well. They definitely do their research and discover the facts, all these things which are actually public record, even if it can be difficult to get to the minute details of these things, which is really where, of course, it gets interesting, and where you learn a lot from looking at the particulars of various different situations. So sometimes people who happen to have done that work are very liberal, and therefore it's necessary to do a great deal of sifting of things they say in order to get the correct take on things. And sometimes it's very good. For example, you may be aware of the fact that all of the information that you get in, the Modern Errors courses, certainly this year, the new theology courses, all of that comes from books written by people who think all that stuff was really great, either by the new theologians themselves or by people who are huge fans of them. In other words, people who don't hide anything. They put forth their agenda. Especially since Vatican II, they put forth their agenda as being something. Here's our great program. Meaning that they don't hide anything. So, but if you understand it correctly, if you're capable of processing the information as it actually ought to be perceived, then you realize actually how bad this is. So that's why I refer to well-written books or well-researched books written by people who are clearly talented authors, talented writers, but whose books still cannot be recommended because of the way they present things. So we'll definitely see more of that. So even so, that the fact that they are that they have an affinity for certain people or for certain ideas and certain programs, certain agendas, definitely there are advantages to reading things written by those people if you are properly inoculated to it beforehand and know how to actually process the information they are presenting. So just a note on that I mention that all the time, that this author is the author from which these notes are taken, any section of these notes, definitely did his homework and knows what he's talking about to an extent, but whose works we still cannot recommend because of his problems. So going back to we're really just giving some background here. We're talking about the situation in France in 1944 when Pius XII installed Giuseppe Roncalli as the nuncio to France, and the reasons why he assigned him as nuncio to France. So as part of the background to that, we're seeing that the resistance movement had divided French Catholics. So as we mentioned before, in 1940, the Nazi Germany invades France. In fact, their battle plan was such that the French and the British fell right into the trap that had been set for their armies, meaning that the capacity for the French military to resist was reduced to effectively zero almost right away. And the best that the British could do was just escape. They're very, very famously doing so in 1940 at the Dunkirk evacuation. But that meant that what they were doing, it's interesting because that is really a retreat and a military catastrophe that's oftentimes celebrated as a victory of sorts. But it was really just that the British had landed there just as they had landed there in 1914 to assist in the defense of France from the German invasion. Only in 1940, the attempt to prevent that invasion and to prevent the Germans from toppling the French government just failed utterly. Just 100% failed. The Germans, in fact, toppled the Third Republic. And we saw it before, they called in Marshal Pétain from his retirement to head some kind of government to govern what was left for a French government to govern. And during that whole time, after having officially made peace with Germany, there was still a great deal of resistance activity. This was a phenomenon that appeared everywhere, any place that happened to be conquered by the German military, any occupied nation, and there were quite a few of those, all this resistance activity, so sabotage, espionage, all that sort of thing, going on in these occupied territories, places that don't want to be occupied by the Germans. They would engage in all sorts of things like that. So you could study all of it, but in France, in particular, all of those people who were involved in that were all leftists. They were people who saw their friends as being the communists in Russia who were still fighting the war. All of this was the people who were involved in this in France in particular. We're just talking about France here. Were all leftists. So those of the school of Marx-Sangnier, you said in the notes on page 26 before going to the encyclical of St. Pius X that condemned the Sillon movement, sociological modernist. Those of the school of Marx-Sangnier became ardent Gaullists, and this refers to Charles de Gaulle, those who supported de Gaulle's government coming into France. Remember, de Gaulle, who had fled France, had left Pétain to deal with, among many others. De Gaulle was not the French president when the Germans toppled the Third Republic, but he still, as many others did, he just fled France. And there you can find photographs of him sitting there in London giving radio broadcasts to the French resistance, but sitting in London while he did it. And only coming back once the tide had clearly turned and Allied military advances meant that France was free, was rapidly being freed of German occupation, the parts of it anyway that had been occupied. So again, just going back to the Sillon movement, it's a good review. It's a review of some things we saw last year. but I think we're on page 2 of these notes for Notre Charge Apostolique, that St. Pius X says, at the top of that page, that the Sillon proposes to raise up and re-educate the working class. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. May I go get some painkillers? I have a headache.
Yes. And he says here, in this respect, the principles of Catholic doctrine have been defined, and the history of Christian civilization bears witness to their beneficent fruitfulness. Our predecessor of happy memory, Leo XIII, he's referring to here, reaffirmed them in masterly documents, and all Catholics dealing with social questions have the duty to study them and to keep them in mind. He taught, among other things, that Christian democracy must preserve the diversity of classes, which is assuredly the attribute of a soundly constituted state, and it must seek to give human society the form and character which God, its author, has imparted to it. So in other words, it is true, of course, that all men are, as far as having immortal souls, that is true of everybody. But what is not true is that, to assert that all men are created equal in their level in society. That is not true. There must necessarily be, as St. Pius X, quoting Leo XIII here, alludes to, there must necessarily be there must necessarily be levels in human society. There must necessarily be a hierarchy, because it just illustrates the principle enunciated by St. Thomas that without subordination there can be no coordination. To put that in a more popular way, if there are, it's possible to have too many chiefs and not enough Indians. In other words, everybody's trying to be in charge. Everybody's the same. Everybody, in that sense, is a chief. Then nothing will get done. Everybody has a slightly different idea. That's just the way things are. Human nature is such that everybody has a slightly different idea of the way things should be. And so if everybody, if there is no voice of authority to decide which way things shall actually be, then nothing will ever get done. So that's not to say that someone invested with authority, truly coming from God, will make all of the best decisions all the time, or even in different cases at all necessarily. It does mean that somebody has to have the final say in things. Otherwise, nothing will ever happen. So, all that must be preserved. Everything which is natural to human society which God himself, the author of nature, has imparted to it, must be retained. Our predecessor denounced a certain democracy which goes so far in its wickedness as to place sovereignty in the people and aims at the suppression of classes and their leveling down. So, remember that we can develop this a bit in a second. But what have the leaders of the Sillon done? Not only have they adopted a program and teaching different from that of Leo XIII, which would be of itself a singularly audacious decision on the part of laymen, thus taking up, concurrent with the sovereign pontiff, the role of director of social action in the church, but they have openly rejected the program laid out by Leo XIII and have adopted another which is diametrically opposed to it. Further, they reject the doctrine recalled by Leo XIII on the essential principles of society. They place authority in the people, or gradually suppress it and strive, as their ideal, to effect the leveling down of the classes. In opposition to Catholic doctrine, therefore, they are proceeding towards a condemned ideal. The Sillon places public authority primarily in the people, from whom it then flows into the government in such a manner, however, that it continues to reside in the people. So something to keep in mind here, some of you who may have studied Catholic political philosophy remember that we've covered this in previous years, that there are different theories as to how exactly authority comes to be invested in those who have it. Because this is, we're talking here among Catholics, because, well, as you've seen, that the idea of democracy as a condemned system, condemned by the church, is the idea that, which arises from Protestantism, democracy as a condemned system holds that authority resides primordially in the people, and that they just they hire out. So they in a sense, in a way that you might hire a janitor, that the people, the mass of the people who cannot exercise that authority, diffused among themselves. Everybody recognizes that the masses cannot just exercise authority over themselves, even those who imagine that it resides primordially with them. There's still the idea that somebody has to be concentrated in the group, in the hands of either one person or of a few people, relatively few people, at least, in order for there to be any kind of functioning society at all, which we need. And even the worst liberals, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for example, who had the idea that the ideal of man was the noble savage running around in the woods by himself, completely free to do whatever he wants, not constrained by any kind of social norms. Even people who imagine that is the ideal state of man, which it's not, but even those who imagine that it is, still admit, well, that society is a necessary evil, because running around in the woods by yourself might be great because you can do whatever you want, but life is a little difficult. It's a little difficult to chase down a deer and kill it and prepare it with your bare hands to eat. Right, that is a little bit difficult. So it's best that we come together. Okay, so we'll start banding together in the form of hunting parties, and it's more comfortable to live in a house than it is to live out in the open all the time. So we'll band together. It's easier to have many people building a house than just one. So we'll gather ourselves together. We'll form contracts. That's the idea. That's why Rousseau had this idea of the social contract. So if you ever hear that term, that's an immediate red flag. This person is of that school, and that is false. So in other words, the idea of all these liberals is that ideally a man is completely free, but comes together and forms this social contract to make life easier. But really, the result of that is a necessary evil. That's an evil. Coming together in society is an evil thing. Because then, well, to govern that society in order not to have lawlessness or not to have complete chaos, we have to lay down laws, but that's an evil because the ideal state of man, remember, is completely free to do anything. And laws place restrictions on that. So that's evil. All of that is a necessary evil. Perhaps necessary, but an evil. We could go into all the ideology of Rousseau, but in the end, he says that, yes, these free individuals come together and invest their wills in the state, so that the state becomes then the expression of the common will, and as long as you're in accordance with that common will, you are correct. But what that means then is that just what he's just done there is set up the ideology for socialism, that the state is supreme, not the individual. So he's really kind of ends up contradicting himself and going straight from liberalism to socialism. It leads straight. Liberalism leads straight to socialism. For that reason, the idea that the individual will is supreme, all these individuals putting their wills together, that is supreme. That collection of those wills is the state. Therefore, any individual who wants something that is not in accordance with the state actually is going in against the collective will of all of these individuals, and he is not free to do that. He is not free to go against the general will, and in fact, he has having entered into that social contract himself, he has actually invested his own will into the general will, and if he wants something separate from it, he doesn't really want that. He just thinks he does. He's really going against even his own will and wanting something separate. It's just sick. It's insane. It's crazy, completely crazy. That's Rousseau for you, in a nutshell, anyway. But it starts with the idea. That's how such systems imagine that authority resides primordially in the people, and that they just hire a government, so to speak, to whom they delegate that authority in order to make the running of things easier. It's all that is a necessary evil, but that's how it is. So those are condemned systems, even among Catholics who acknowledge that all authority comes from God. All authority comes from God. He is the source of it, not the people, at least not ultimately. There are some systems that imagine that God, since authority comes from God, then who transfers it to the people, who themselves then transfer it to those who rule over them. That is not contrary to faith, But it is actually, St. Pius X says here that this is it's contrary to what Leo XIII teaches. That he definitely came down in favor of the opposite theory, which is that of designation, that the people have authority never resides with the people at any point. They simply designate whom they want to have rule over them, and then God grants the authority from above. That's certainly the case of the Roman pontiff. That authority comes from Christ immediately. Everybody acknowledges that. Even those who hold the theory that when the civil order, that authority goes from God to the people, and that who then, after that, having received it from God, then transfer it to those who rule over them. Even they who hold that theory, Catholics who hold that, acknowledge that in the case of the Roman pontiff, the case of the vicar of Christ on earth, that the church simply designates and Christ grants the authority from above immediately. That everybody, all Catholics acknowledge that. But it seems that, yes, definitely when you read the encyclicals of Leo XIII, that he came down without intending to define it, but he came down on the side of the designation theory. So that requires internal assent, even if he didn't intend to define it. And coming here, he's talking about Sillon placing the public authority primarily in the people, from whom it then flows into the government in such a manner, however, that it continues to reside in the people. So and Catholics would say that once that authority has been transferred, then it has truly been transferred to the rulers, that it cannot reside in the people, but it is then transferred to the rulers. Whereas Rousseau and company say that it really continues to reside with the people, and they can take it back. Therefore, you have all of the reasoning, all of the supposed justification for revolutions, why you can then go and overthrow your government if you don't like them. If the janitor's not doing his job, you fire the janitor, right? So the rulers aren't doing what you want them to do, you fire your rulers. And maybe they won't go along with that. Maybe you have to rise up in revolution and kill them and chop off all their heads or something. Bring out the guillotines when it's convenient. But you can do that because you have authority ultimately still. And that's all that is false. Leo XIII absolutely condemned this doctrine in his encyclical De Uternum Illud on political government. So he says here, admittedly, the Sillon holds that authority, which first places in the people, which it first places in the people, descends from God, but in such a way as to return from below upwards, whilst in the organization of the church, power descends from above downwards, as we just said. But besides its being abnormal for the delegation of power to ascend, since it is in its nature to descend, Leo XIII refuted in advance this attempt to reconcile Catholic doctrine with the error of philosophism. For, he continues, it is necessary to remark here that those who preside over the government of public affairs may indeed, in certain cases, be chosen by the will and judgment of the multitude without repugnance or opposition to Catholic doctrine. But whilst this choice marks out the ruler, it does not confer upon him the authority to govern. It does not delegate the power. It designates the person who will be invested with it. So this is exactly what we were saying. This is St. Pius X reiterating Leo XIII, who came down clearly on the side of designation. That the people simply, yes, this happens all the time, actually, even in the most absolute monarchies that have ever existed. This holds true. Even in the case where you have a hereditary monarchy, a monarch who is as autocratic as it can get, there is still a certain designation on the part of the people. At the very least, when the king or the emperor or whatever his title is dies and his son succeeds to the throne, all the people, at the very least, designate that successor by tacitly approving of him. They just don't do anything. Okay, that's the established way of determining the successor by all of the laws governing this hereditary monarchy and the way that the realm is inherited. We all agree with that. The new ruler comes in. Okay, that's just normal. He's crowned. He begins to administer the kingdom. He passes laws that carries out all of the functions of a ruler. Nobody objects at any point. Then they tacitly accept it. There, he is just as much designated as in the case of, or the effect is exactly the same as, say, going through an official election of a president. In some way, everybody approves of it. And this holds true in anybody who actually has authority. And even if it's barbarians wearing skins sitting around the campfire choosing their new chief, the new chief of their tribe, they're still all agreeing, at least tacitly, that this new this new tribal leader will be our ruler. There's always some acceptance on that part. And as we have this here, to a certain extent, the people can even choose which form of government they have. It has to be done according to all the rules. Revolution is never justified. Certainly never the overthrowing of legitimate authority. But to an extent, when a nation is formed, in other words, the people are free to choose what form of government they want. That is possible. It is possible through due process to undergo, if in cases where it can't be done, certain changes to the constitution of the nation, in the cases of nations anyway that have officially written constitutions. You can make changes to alter the form of government. Yeah, that can be done legitimately. Well, no, but in other words, once you have the ruler who is in power and in control of things, he may not be thrown out because you don't like him. That may not be done. His authority comes from God. To rebel against his authority is ultimately to rebel against the authority of God, from whom, as we've said so many times now, all authority comes. So, changes of government, in other words, can be legitimately effected, but revolution is not a legitimate means of effecting any kind of change of government. So, whilst this choice marks out the ruler, it does not confer upon him the authority to govern. It does not delegate the power. It designates the person who will be invested with it. For the rest, if the people remain the holders of power, what becomes of authority? A shadow, a myth. There is no more law properly so called, no more obedience. The Sillon acknowledges this. Indeed, since it demands that threefold political, economic, and intellectual emancipation in the name of human dignity, the future city in the formation of which it is engaged will have no masters and no servants. All citizens will be free, all comrades, all kings. You see where this is going. In other words, it's a way the popes say that you'll end up with too many chiefs and no Indians at all. A command, a precept, would be viewed as an attack upon their freedom. Subordination to any form of superiority would be a diminishment of the human person, and obedience a disgrace. Teaching such doctrines and applying them to its internal organization, the Sillon, therefore, sows erroneous and fatal notions on authority, liberty, and obedience among your Catholic youth. Remember, he's addressing the bishops here. The same is true of justice and equality. The Sillon says that it is striving to establish an era of equality which, by that very fact, would be also an era of greater justice. Thus, to the Sillon, every inequality of condition is an injustice, or at least a diminution of justice. He's posing this as a question. So they see every inequality as an injustice. The fact that one person is at a higher level in society than another, they say that's unjust. Inequality does not equal injustice. Here we have a principle that conflicts sharply with the nature of things. A principle conducive to jealousy, injustice, and subversive to any social order. Thus, democracy alone will bring about the reign of perfect justice. In other words, he is now enunciating the conclusion, to the logical conclusion at least, of all of the reasoning of the Sillon. Is this not an insult to other forms of government, which are thereby debased to the level of sterile makeshifts? In fact, Catholic political philosophers clearly indicate that in itself the best form of government is monarchy. The most in accordance with nature, really in itself the most efficient form of government is a monarchy. It's not to say that it should be employed everywhere unconditionally. Leo XIII does mention that also in his encyclicals, that which form of government among the legitimate options, of course, ought to be chosen in order to determine that in order to determine which form of government is the one which actually should be employed in any particular nation, a great many things have to be taken into consideration. So, for example, you can see it'd be very difficult to see an official monarchy being set up in the United States. Just imagine that. People would never accept anybody with the title of king. There were, ultimately, in many cases, even in such instances as ancient Rome, which where the term rex was a dirty word. They had a few kings and hated them so much that they decided we'll never have a king ever again. We'll have a republic. And then even eventually they have returned to a very, very monarchical system, that of the emperors. Even so, the very term emperor is derived from imperator. That's a military title. They were never willing to use the word king ever again. But they ended up with, the emperors were as autocratic as it was possible to be. They were kings. In every sense that mattered, they were kings. But they never had the title rex, because that was a dirty word. Not to be had. Nobody has that title. No, not around here. No kings around here. We'll have emperors. That's fine. No kings, though. So, just certain things like that have to be taken into consideration. So it's not, here, things always tend in that direction, towards their most natural form. That includes government. So, when you have a highly inefficient form of government, as we have in this country, it's checks and balances. What that means is let's deliberately make the government inefficient so that there's as much strife as possible, and things will take as long as possible to get done. When you have a system like that, people will just start, their frustration, it was out of frustration, desperation, will start looking for ways to make things a little easier to deal with. And so that's why there's nothing in the Constitution of the United States about political parties. All this stuff of having effectively two political parties, it's purely procedural. Just a question of, who can get together a group of his friends and political allies and control this system? Who can make it so that the system serves his own ends? So how can you get it so that you can pass laws through Congress with no opposition? Now, that's great. If a political party can get enough seats in Congress so that they can pass whatever laws they want, that's great. Okay, well, why not just make a system where you don't have to go through that step, where there's not constant fighting over seats in Congress or over the presidency? It's deliberate, every few years, choosing a new ruler, choosing a new president. That's a deliberately unstable system. In itself, why do that? What good reason is there to have a government that it purposely changes itself every 4 to 8 years? Why do that? It's deliberately inefficient and unstable. So, people who like to set up democracy as the ideal form of government are just, certainly in the opinions of Catholic political philosophers, just wrong. Even we're not even talking about democracy as a condemned system, condemned ideology rising from Protestantism. We're talking about just as a legitimate form of government. It's, in the opinion of everybody who's objective about it, is down the list, definitely, to say the least, from monarchy. Consider it again, abstracting from any particular situation in which someone might want to implement a monarchy. So on all of this, the Sillonists once again clash with the teaching of Leo XIII. In the encyclical on political government, which we have already quoted, they could have read this: "Justice being preserved, it is not forbidden to the people to choose for themselves the form of government which best corresponds with their character or with the institutions and customs handed down by their forefathers." This is just what we said before. That within the bounds of what is legitimate, people can choose a form of government or alter an existing one within the bounds of what is legitimate. Finally, at the root of all of their fallacies on social questions lie the false hopes of Sillonists on human dignity. According to them, man will be a man truly worthy of the name only when he has acquired a strong, enlightened, and independent consciousness, able to do without a master, obeying only himself, and able to assume the most demanding responsibilities without faltering. Such are the big words by which human pride is exalted, like a dream carrying man away without light, without guidance, and without help into the realm of illusion, in which he will be destroyed by his errors and passions, whilst awaiting the glorious day of his full consciousness. We close here our observation on the errors of the Sillon. We do not claim to have exhausted the subject, for we should yet draw your attention to other points that are equally false and dangerous. For example, on the manner to interpret the concept of the coercive power of the church. So you say we have not covered everything there is to say on this. We have not even covered everything St. Pius X said in this encyclical. But there you have it, a background on the straying, and this was condemned by St. Pius X. Of course, all of this was already condemned by Leo XIII, clearly. Was always contrary to the teachings of the Church on the nature of authority. All of this was put forward again during the reign of St. Pius X. This encyclical Notre Charge Apostolique was promulgated in 1910. Here where we're looking at now is 34 years later, 1944. The Sillon movement, those who were of that school of thought, those who held to those ideas despite the fact that they were condemned, were the people who were behind Charles de Gaulle and who were the resistance movement during the war. So Pius XII, meanwhile, stood by, remember, Monsignor Valerio Valeri, his erstwhile nuncio to France, and he refused to name a new nuncio. September, October, November passed by, and still the Vatican had not officially recognized the new regime in France, which is, if I'm counting correctly here, the Fourth Republic that they were setting up at this point. They're on number 5 now. That one too was actually founded while de Gaulle was still around, but it was because there was something about the fourth one he didn't like. This was later on. Something about the fourth one he didn't like, so he demanded that one be shut down and a new one started up for him to stay. And because he was effectively the king of France, they did it. So eventually, Pius XII decided to give way and appoint a new nuncio quickly. His first choice was Archbishop Joseph Fieta, since 1936 nuncio to Argentina, who was telegraphed on December 2nd, 1944. He replied the next day, declining the post in Paris, on health grounds. So Domenico Tardini therefore dispatched the fateful telegram to Roncalli on December 5th. It had all been done at great speed, and Roncalli was the second choice for France. He was the stopgap. Remember, he is in exile, effectively, in Istanbul at this point. So not much was known about him in Rome, but now he was suddenly catapulted into the Vatican's most prestigious diplomatic post at age 63, perfectly well aware that he did not come out of the top drawer of Vatican diplomats. But notice this statement here. It was comforting for Roncalli to know that the Pope had singled him out. Pope Pius XII.